The Mill at Alder Brook, Episode 2, Along the Upper Millrace.
Tessa came down the lane in the long, mild part of the evening, carrying a small canvas bag in one hand and a thermos in the other. The day had begun to loosen its hold on the fields. Warmth still rested in the packed earth beneath her boots, but the hedges had already taken on the cooler smell of leaves and shade. Alder Brook announced itself before she reached the footbridge. Its sound rose from beyond the last bend in the lane, broad and steady, softening the smaller noises around it. The brush of her coat sleeve, the measured fall of her steps, and the faint movement of branches overhead all seemed to settle into the same easy rhythm. The footbridge lay ahead in the pale evening light. Its wooden rails were dry, though the air above the brook felt cool against her hands. Tessa crossed at an unhurried pace. Near the middle, she stopped and looked upstream. The brook wound between its familiar banks, carrying small pieces of reflected sky on its surface. A little farther along, part of the water entered the maintained Millrace and continued toward the mill. From the bridge, the two courses seemed almost to overlap. The wider brook moved with a loose, changing sound, while the narrower race made a smoother hush beside the bank. Tessa listened for a moment, then continued across. The mill yard was quiet when she entered it. Gravel shifted beneath her boots and became still again. The old mill stood beside the water, with the grain loft above the main floor and the wheelroom below. Beyond the kitchen garden, the bakehouse and orchard rested in the lowering light. Their roofs and branches were unchanged, each in its ordinary place. She set the thermos on the bench near the mill door and took out the key. The lock turned without resistance. When the door opened, the cooler air inside moved past her with the familiar sense of timber, canvas, and flower dust. There was also the slight dampness that belonged to the rooms nearest the water. None of it was stale. It was simply the smell of a working building at rest. Tessa stepped inside and left the door open behind her. For a little while, she did nothing more than stand on the main floor and allow her eyes to adjust. Evening light entered through the windows in broad, quiet bands. It lay across the boards and caught the pale dust in the grain of the wood. The heavy beams above remained in shadow. Somewhere in the upper part of the building, a board gave one small creak as the warmth of the day began to leave it. Below came the enclosed sound of running water. Tessa placed her canvas bag on a table. She had brought only what she needed for the evening: a notebook, a pencil, a pair of work gloves, and a folded cloth. The millrace did not require tools for heavy work. There would be no cutting, digging, or repair. She meant only to walk the maintained path, lift out the leaves and small twigs that had fallen since her last look, and check the water against the 3 familiar stones. Before going outside again, she walked through the mill. She began with the main floor, moving from window to window. Each latch sat properly in place. The boards beneath her felt firm and dry. Along one wall, empty bins waited with their lids resting squarely. A few canvas sacks stood folded nearby, ready for the later work of the week. Their rough surfaces held the warm, dusty smell of grain even while empty. Tessa brushed one hand over the table and looked at the faint line her fingers made in the flour dust. It was not enough to require cleaning tonight. The grain loft would have its own evenings soon, and the sacks and bins would be taken in order then. For now, it was enough to know that everything above her was settled. She glanced toward the loft stairs but did not climb them. This evening belonged to the water. At the back of the main floor, she opened the inner door and went down to the wheelroom. The stairs were narrow and familiar. The air cooled with each step, and the sound of the channel became fuller until it seemed to occupy the whole lower room. The wheel remained secured and unloaded. Nothing in the mechanism was being asked to turn. The old wood stood dark beside the passing water, and the resting parts held their weight without complaint. Tessa stopped at the foot of the stairs. Water moved through the channel in a continuous run, slipping beneath the motionless structure and onward toward the brook. The sound changed around the beams and stonework. Near the entrance, it was a close murmur. Farther under the wheel, it deepened, then grew lighter again as the water passed into the open air. She watched long enough to separate those ordinary changes from the pace of the flow itself. The channel seemed a little quieter than she remembered. Not alarmingly so, and not even greatly so. It was only a difference that invited checking. From inside the wheelroom, she could not see where the upper water divided, and she knew better than to make a conclusion from sound alone. She rested her palm briefly against one of the dry wooden supports. It held a trace of the day's warmth. "All settled," she said. Her voice was low, and the room did not seem to need any further remark. She climbed back to the main floor. At the open door, evening air met her again, carrying the scent of the kitchen garden and damp soil. She took the thermos from the bench, slipped the notebook and pencil into her coat pocket, and drew on the work gloves. The Millrace path began beyond the wheelhouse. It ran close to the water at first, then followed the bank upstream toward the sluice meadow. Tessa could see the first stretch from the yard, a narrow strip of firm ground, uneven with roots but easy to walk when taken slowly. She closed the mill door but did not lock it. She would return before the light had gone, and the yard was still and empty. At the corner of the wheelhouse, she paused to look back. From there, the arrangement of the place was simple. The main floor stood above the wheel room, and the loft rose above them both. The kitchen garden occupied the sheltered ground beyond the yard. Past it were the bakehouse and the first trees of the orchard. The brook continued along the lower edge of the property, while the Millrace approached by its narrower course from upstream. Nothing was far from anything else. The whole place could be crossed in a few minutes. Yet each part had its own sound and temperature, and each asked for a different kind of attention. The path beside the Millrace was cooler than the yard. Grasses leaned over its outer edge, their tips moving when a light breeze passed. On the water side, the bank descended only a short way to the smooth surface of the race. Tessa began upstream. She did not walk quickly. The purpose of the walk was to notice what was present, and speed would have made the path less useful. At every few steps, she looked down through the water. The shallow bottom showed itself in patches of brown stone, pale grit, and dark trailing strands of water plants. Where the bank cast a shadow, the surface became reflective and held the shapes of leaves above. The flow looked uneven. Near the outer edge, narrow lines moved briskly around small stones. Closer to the inner bank, the water seemed almost still. A leaf floated a short distance, turned once, and then continued. Nothing was blocked. The water was moving everywhere, though not always at the same visible pace. Tessa crouched beside the first bend. A handful of fallen leaves had gathered against two crossed twigs. The little cluster trembled in the current but had not formed a barrier. Water passed around it easily on both sides. She reached down with one gloved hand and lifted the twigs free. The leaves loosened at once. Some continued downstream, while others remained close enough for her to gather. She placed the wet handful on the upper bank, where it could drain and settle into the grass. The cleared water made almost the same sound as before. That was what she expected. This was ordinary tidying, not a rescue of the channel. The Millrace had been built and maintained to carry water steadily, and a few leaves did not alter its purpose. She straightened and continued. At the next clear patch, she saw the first of the three familiar stones. It rested near the bank, flat-topped and gray, with a pale line around its side where the usual water level had left a faint mark. Tessa knelt and studied it without moving it. The current touched a little below the pale line. She took out the notebook, opened it against her knee, and wrote a short entry for the first stone. The pencil moved firmly over the paper. She did not need a complicated measure. The stone's old line, the width of one finger, and the visible edge of the water gave her all the comparison she needed. When the note was made, she returned the notebook to her pocket. Farther upstream, the race narrowed slightly between low banks. Here the water moved faster at the center, making fine, shifting lines over the bottom. A single twig had caught against a tuft of grass. Tessa lifted it out as she passed. A few more leaves lay pressed to the bank, but they were not in the maintained water path, so she left them where they were. The air held the clean scent of wet stone. It mixed with the greener smell drifting from the kitchen garden behind her. After another bend, Tessa stopped. Through a break in the grasses, she could see the small side channel that turned away from the Millrace toward the garden. It was carrying a modest ribbon of water between its low edges. The split was neat and ordinary. No bank had given way, and no water was escaping where it should not. The side channel was simply doing its usual work, taking a share of the flow to the garden beds. That explained the quieter sound in the wheelroom. It also explained why the surface had appeared uneven below the turn. The water remaining in the race spread itself across the channel after the division, faster in some lines and smoother in others. Nothing had been lost. It had only gone by another familiar route. Tessa stood beside the fork and watched both courses for a while. One moved toward the mill. The other passed toward the kitchen garden. Each followed its maintained path, and both were clear. She took out the notebook again. At the bottom of the first entry, she wrote that the garden side channel was open and drawing normally. Then she closed the notebook and returned it to her pocket. There was no longer any question to carry upstream. The apparent difference had a plain cause, visible from the bank, and complete in itself. Tessa adjusted the thermos beneath her arm and continued toward the sluice meadow. The path opened gradually as she walked. The tight shade near the wheelhouse gave way to softer evening light. Ahead, the meadow lay quiet beyond the last bend, and somewhere along the remaining stretch waited the second and third stones. Behind her, water continued toward the garden and the resting mill. Ahead, it came steadily through the maintained race, touched by leaves, grasses, and the fading sky. Tessa followed it at the same easy pace, with the first depth recorded and the evening's small question already answered. The path widened after the last bend, and Tessa stepped into the softer light at the edge of the sluice meadow. Here, the Millrace looked different from the shaded stretch below. The banks were lower and more open, and the evening sky lay across the water in long, pale strips. Grasses grew close to the path, green at their roots and dry at the tips. When the breeze passed over them, they leaned together and rose again with a faint, brushing sound. Tessa stopped before going farther. The sluice stood upstream at the head of the maintained race, plain and still in its familiar setting. Water entered beneath it at an even pace. There was no rush around the edges, no heap of leaves pressed against the opening, and no branch resting across the channel. The water simply passed through and continued along the meadow. From where she stood, Tessa could see why the lower flow had seemed difficult to judge. Up here before the garden side channel divided it, the race carried a fuller breadth of water. The surface moved steadily from bank to bank. Farther down, after the division, the same movement spread into narrower lines and quieter margins. She set the thermos on a flat patch of grass and looked back along the way she had come. The mill itself was hidden by the bend and the low growth beside the race, but its position was easy to hold in mind. Downstream lay the side channel, then the first familiar stone, then the wheelhouse and yard. Beyond the yard were the kitchen garden, the bakehouse, and the orchard. The brook followed its wider course nearby. Nothing had changed its place. She had only walked far enough to see the water before it divided. Tessa took off one glove and touched the back of her fingers to the surface. The water was cool without being cold. It pressed lightly around her skin and slipped on. She dried her hand against the folded cloth from her canvas bag, put the glove on again, and picked up the thermos. The second stone rested a short distance beyond the meadow bend. It was darker than the first, rounded at the top, with a narrow seam running across one side. Years of water had made that seam useful. When the race was carrying its usual mild weather level, the surface met the lower edge of it. After rain, the seam disappeared. In a dry spell, more of the stone showed beneath it. Tessa crouched on the firm bank. The water touched the seam almost exactly. Now and then a small ripple climbed over it, then drew back. She watched several of those ripples before taking out her notebook. Beside the first mark, she added a second. The first stone had stood a little below its pale line. The second met its seam. That difference was ordinary because the stones did not sit in identical parts of the channel. One was below the garden turn, where the race had already given some of its water to the beds. The other was above it, where the full maintained flow still passed. Tessa closed the notebook but kept it in her hand. A few yellow leaves had collected in a shallow pocket just upstream from the stone. They lay one over another, their edges moving in the current. A thin twig held them against the bank. She put the notebook away and reached down. The twig came free at once. Tessa laid it on the grass, then lifted the leaves in 2 wet handfuls. Water ran between her gloved fingers and returned to the race. Beneath the leaves, the channel edge was clear and firm. There was nothing else caught there. She placed the leaves beside the twig, far enough from the bank that the next breeze would not drop them straight back into the water. When she looked again, the level at the stone was unchanged. That, too, was expected. Removing a small gathering of leaves did not deepen the race or quicken the whole flow. It only kept the maintained path neat and allowed the water to pass without carrying the little cluster farther down. Tessa stood and brushed her hands together. The path continued beside the meadow in an easy curve. She followed it, pausing where the bank dipped, or where the surface made a different pattern around a stone. Most of what had fallen into the race could remain. A single leaf moving freely with the current needed no attention. Neither did the small pieces of grass resting beneath the clear water. She removed only what had gathered into loose catches along the edges. At one place, 3 slender twigs lay almost parallel across a narrow shelf of grit. They were no thicker than knitting needles. Water ran above and below them, making a faint trembling line. Tessa lifted them one at a time. The first was smooth and pale. The second carried 2 small leaves. The third had lodged beneath the others and came away with a thread of dark water plant looped over it. She eased the plant free and let it remain rooted in the channel. Then she set the twigs together on the upper bank. The water settled back into the same quiet pattern. Farther on, she found a scatter of brown leaves resting against the inner curve. Most were flat against the bank, and outside the moving center of the race. She left those alone. 2 had folded around a small forked twig, so she removed the twig and let the leaves separate. One drifted downstream. The other turned slowly and came to rest several feet away, no longer caught. This first round of the meadow required no more than that. Tessa walked to the sluice and stood beside it without touching the setting. The wood was damp near the water and dry above. Its secured parts sat squarely, and the narrow opening beneath carried the race's ordinary supply. She leaned slightly to look along the upstream edge. A few leaves moved past in the brook and continued beyond the entrance. One came close to the sluice, turned in the gentler water, and went on. No mat of leaves had formed. No small branch needed lifting. There was nothing to adjust. Tessa stepped back and looked down the length of the meadow. In the open light, the race seemed almost motionless until she watched a small mark on the surface. A pale seed husk traveled steadily away from the sluice. It passed the second stone, drew toward the center, and continued around the bend. The movement was quiet, but it was complete. She returned to the flat patch of grass where she had first set down the thermos. The ground there was dry enough to sit on, so she lowered herself carefully and stretched her legs toward the path. The thermos cup turned loose with a soft scrape. When she poured, a little steam rose into the cooling air. The drink smelled faintly of mint. Tessa held the cup between both hands and let the warmth settle through her gloves before taking the first sip. For several minutes, she sat without looking for anything in particular. The meadow had its own scale of sound. Near her, the Millrace made a smooth, close murmur. Beyond it, Alder Brook could be heard more broadly, sometimes louder and sometimes softer as the breeze moved through the grasses. An insect passed with a brief hum and disappeared into the meadow. The dry tips of the grass touched one another. Water continued beneath all of it. Tessa drank again. A few leaves rested on the surface near the outer bank. They moved apart, came together, and separated once more. None stayed still long enough to catch. The full channel entered from the sluice, past the second stone, and went downstream toward the garden turn. After a while, footsteps sounded on the meadow path. They were unhurried footsteps approaching from upstream along the ordinary way home. Tessa turned her head. A neighbor came into view at the edge of the meadow, carrying nothing that required help and walking with the settled pace of someone who knew the path well. "Evening," the neighbor said. "Evening." Tessa lifted the thermos slightly. "There's enough for a cup." The neighbor stopped, glanced at the water, and accepted. Tessa poured a second small serving into the spare cup from her bag. They sat a little apart on the dry grass, facing the race. For a time, neither spoke. The neighbor took a slow drink and watched the water pass the bend. "Looks clear," came the quiet observation. "It is," Tessa said. "The garden channel's taking its usual share. That was the difference I heard below." The neighbor nodded, as though this fitted with everything the meadow already showed. "The beds will be glad of it. They should be." That was enough explanation. The side channel had not opened by accident, and the quieter run near the mill was not a sign of trouble. A modest part of the water was going where it was meant to go. Through the maintained turn toward the kitchen garden. They finished their drinks while the evening light thinned over the grass. Tessa took the empty cup, wiped its rim with the folded cloth, and packed it into the canvas bag. The neighbor rose and brushed a few dry blades from one sleeve. "Good night, then. Good night." The footsteps continued downstream along the path. At the meadow bend they softened, and after another minute they could no longer be heard above the water. Tessa remained seated until the warmth in her own cup had faded a little. She finished the last mouthful, screwed the cup onto the thermos, and stood. The third familiar stone lay near the upper end of the meadow, not far below the sluice. She had left it until after the break, because the light there would remain clear for a while. The bank beside it was open, and the sky still gave enough brightness to read the old mark. She walked back along the race, carrying the thermos under one arm. At the second stone, the water continued to touch the lower edge of the seam. The cleared leaves remained on the grass where she had placed them. No new cluster had formed. She did not open the notebook again. The mark she had made was enough. The third stone came into view as she approached the sluice. It was the smallest of the three, a pale, nearly square piece set close to the inner bank. Its top rose above the surface, and a darker band showed where water regularly touched its side. Tessa crouched beside it. The level sat within that darker band. It was neither at the upper edge nor the lower, but comfortably between them. Water curved around the stone, joined again beyond it, and continued toward the second marker. She watched the curve several times. Each one followed the same path. Then she opened the notebook and made the third entry. The 3 marks now gave her a simple picture of the race. Near the sluice, the water sat within the usual band. At the second stone, it met the seam. Below the garden turn, it ran a little beneath the first stone's pale line. The change followed the ordinary division of the water and required no correction. Tessa added one final note. Leaves light, small twigs removed, sluice setting unchanged. She closed the notebook and returned it to her pocket. Before leaving the upper meadow, she walked once more from the third stone to the bend. It was not a new inspection and did not produce a new question. She was only retracing the short section in the direction the water traveled. At the third stone, the race divided around pale rock and came together. At the second, it touched the old seam. Between the stones, it passed the cleared edges without gathering or hesitation. Beyond the bend, it continued toward the side channel and the mill. Tessa picked up the last 2 twigs she had placed on the grass and set them with the others farther from the water. The leaves could remain where they would dry and settle into the meadow. Nothing else needed carrying. The light had begun to turn from pale gold to gray. There was still plenty to see by, but the open meadow no longer held the warmth it had when she arrived. Coolness gathered close to the race and along the cuffs of her coat. She adjusted the canvas bag on her shoulder and tucked the thermos securely beneath her arm. The first round was complete. All 3 stones had been seen. 2 were now recorded, joining the first mark already made below. The light debris had been lifted from the maintained path. The sluice remained secured in its familiar position. The uneven-looking flow had been explained by the garden side channel, which was clear and watering the beds as intended. Tessa stood at the meadow bend and listened once more. Water entered above her, moved past the stones, and continued around the curve. Its sound did not ask her to stay. It simply gave her the steady line she would follow back toward the mill. She turned downstream. There would be another quiet look at the side channel on the return, then a final check of the first stone in the dusk. After that, she could carry the 3 levels inside, set them down properly in the record, and listen from the wheel room as the secured, unloaded channel received the evening water. For now, the path was clear beneath her boots, the meadow was settled behind her, and the Millrace led home in one familiar course. Tessa followed the Millrace downstream, keeping to the same easy pace she had used on the way up. The sluice meadow remained open behind her for a little while. Its grasses held the last pale light along their dry tips, and the water carried a narrow reflection of the sky between the low banks. Ahead, the path curved into deeper shade. The mill was still out of sight, but the race gave her a clear line toward it. She passed the third familiar stone first. Its pale top stood above the surface, while the darker band along its side remained partly covered. Water divided around the stone and joined again below it. The level looked just as it had when she recorded it. Tessa did not stop to write another note. She slowed for a few steps, saw that the mark was steady, and continued. The water moved in the same direction as she did, though it reached each bend before her. Near the center of the channel, its surface drew into long, smooth lines. Along the edges, it passed more slowly through the shadows of grass and low plants. A loose leaf turned in one of those quiet margins, found the stronger movement again, and traveled on. At the second stone, Tessa paused. The old seam across its side was still touched by the water. Small ripples climbed over the lower edge and slipped back. The leaves and twigs she had removed lay on the upper bank, dark with moisture, but already beginning to curl as they drained. Nothing new had gathered in their place. She stood with the thermos tucked under her arm and listened. The open meadow gave the Millrace room to sound broad and even. There was no single splash or catch to draw her attention, only the close murmur of water passing over grit and around the rounded stone. That part of the evening's work was finished. Tessa moved on. Beyond the meadow bend, the banks rose slightly and the path narrowed. Roots showed through the firm ground in familiar places. She stepped over them without needing to look for each one. The air beneath the overhanging branches was cooler, and the smell of wet stone became stronger. A few small leaves had fallen since her upstream walk. One rested on the path near her boot. Another floated freely near the middle of the race. She left both where they were. The first belonged to the bank, and the second was moving without difficulty. At the inner curve, the brown leaves she had noticed earlier remained pressed flat beyond the main water path. They made a thin, dark border along the channel. The forked twig was gone from among them, now resting safely higher on the bank where she had placed it. Tessa bent slightly to look at the cleared edge. Water moved over the shallow grit beneath it. A small, bright patch appeared where the surface caught the sky, then disappeared when the breeze shifted the branches above. There was no catch beneath the leaves, and no hidden tangle. The edge was simply shallow, which was why the water looked quieter there. She straightened and continued. The path descended almost too gently to notice. Tessa felt the change mostly in the water. It gathered a little more visible pace as it approached the narrower stretch, making fine lines around the stones on the bottom. The lines crossed and opened again, always passing downstream. She came to the 3 slender twigs she had removed from the shelf of grit. They lay together in the grass. One still held the 2 small leaves it had carried from the race. Tessa picked them up. They were light enough to hold between 2 gloved fingers. Rather than leave them close to the bank, she carried them a short way and tucked them beneath a low hedge where they could dry among older fallen pieces. The action took only a moment. When she returned to the path, the water had continued without her. At the next bend, the sound changed. It became softer on the millside and slightly sharper toward the garden. Tessa knew she had reached the side channel before she could see the turn itself. The division separated one body of water into 2 smaller runs, each with its own narrow sound. She stepped through the break in the grasses. The garden side channel left the Millrace at its maintained opening and curved away between low, firm edges. The modest ribbon of water still moved toward the kitchen garden. It was clear enough for Tessa to see the bottom. Dark soil in the quieter places, small brown stones where the flow tightened, and a few pale roots near the bank. She had already seen that the channel was open. She had already written that it was drawing normally. On the way back, she meant only to give it the quiet look she had promised herself. Tessa crouched beside the turn. The division was neat. Water approached in a fuller band from the meadow, divided at the firm point between the channels, and continued in both directions. Most stayed in the Millrace. A smaller share entered the garden course. From the standing path, the split had appeared ordinary. From lower down, with her eyes closer to the surface, she noticed one small detail she had not seen before. A single curled leaf had settled against a shallow stone at the mouth of the garden channel. It was not blocking anything. Water slipped beneath its curled edge and passed around both sides. The leaf lifted slightly, settled, and lifted again. Each movement let a narrow glint of water show underneath. Tessa watched it for several breaths. The small discovery explained a faint ticking sound at the turn, a sound so light that it had blended into the movement of the 2 channels while she was standing. Each time the current lifted the leaf, its stem touched the stone. Then the leaf settled and the sound stopped. There was no further meaning in it. It was only a leaf tapping gently against a stone. Tessa reached into the water and lifted it free. The leaf rested in her palm, brown at the center and yellow near one edge. Water ran from its curled shape and fell back into the channel. She placed it on the grass above the bank. Without the leaf, the faint ticking ended. The garden channel continued at the same depth and pace. Its surface passed over the shallow stone with a smooth, nearly silent fold. Tessa stayed crouched a little longer. The difference in sound was clear, but the difference in flow was too small to see because there had been no meaningful difference in flow at all. The leaf had made a noise. It had not held back the water. She looked along the garden channel. The narrow course ran toward the beds in a series of soft turns. From this point, she could not see all the way to the garden, but she did not need to. She had walked beside the lower end earlier, and the channel here was plainly carrying its usual share. There was no unanswered question between the two places. Tessa took the notebook from her pocket. She opened it to the evening's entries and added only a few words beneath the note about the garden turn. One curled leaf lifted at mouth. The entry was almost too small to require recording, but it belonged with the simple account of what she had done. She had found a leaf, lifted it, and left the channel as she had found it, clear and moving. She closed the notebook and stood. The millraces below the division looked smoother, now that she understood each part of its movement. The side channel took its modest share. The remaining water spread across the broader bottom, quick through the center, and slow along the inner bank. From the wheelroom, that spread had sounded quieter. From the path, it had first looked uneven. Seen here at the turn, it was only the ordinary shape of the system. Tessa put the notebook away and adjusted the thermos beneath her arm. Before leaving, she checked the curled leaf on the grass. It lay several hand widths from the edge, where it could dry without slipping back. The water passed below it in both channels. She continued downstream. The light beneath the branches had begun to thin. It was not yet dark, but colors were settling into one another. Brown stones looked gray under the water. Green grass deepened along the bank. The pale grit at the bottom of the race held the most light and showed the path of the current in faint shifting bands. Tessa's boots made a soft, regular sound on the ground. At one narrow place, she stopped to let a long blade of grass spring back from the path. Its wet tip brushed her glove. She moved it gently aside, stepped through, and released it. The blade leaned over the race again, not quite touching the surface. A little farther on, the water passed the cleared shelf where the 3 slender twigs had rested. The dark thread of water plant remained rooted there. It streamed with the current, bending downstream and rising slightly whenever the pace changed over the grit. Tessa was glad she had left it undisturbed. Loose twigs could be lifted. Fallen leaves could be moved from a shallow catch. A rooted plant belonged to the channel and moved with it. The distinctions were plain when she took enough time to look. She came next to the stretch below the garden turn, where the inner bank seemed almost still. A small seed husk floated into that quiet water and slowed. For a moment it appeared to stop. Then it rotated, moved sideways by the width of a finger, and joined a thin current that carried it downstream. Tessa watched until it passed around the bend. The water was moving everywhere. It did not need to move everywhere in the same way. That thought required no place in the notebook. It was only the kind of understanding that came from walking beside a familiar course and seeing it under a different evening light. The first stone waded beyond the next curve. Its flat gray top showed clearly against the darker bank. The pale line around its side remained a little above the water. This was the last level Tessa meant to check before returning to the mill. She set the thermos on the path and crouched. The race touched the stone at the same place she had marked earlier. The distance beneath the pale line looked unchanged. Water pressed gently against the upstream edge, divided and slipped around the sides. A few fine ripples met beyond it. Tessa laid 2 gloved fingers against the dry part of the stone, using their width as the same simple comparison she had used before. The measure agreed with the first entry. Below the garden turn, a little less water continued toward the wheelhouse. Above the turn, the second and third stones held their usual marks. The 3 readings belonged together. Nothing had lowered while she was in the meadow, and nothing had risen. She took out the notebook for the final check. Beside the first entry she added, dusk unchanged. Then she looked over all 3 marks. First stone, a little below the pale line. Second stone, touching the seam. Third stone, within the darker band. Garden channel open and drawing normally. Leaves light. Small twigs removed. Sluice setting unchanged. 1 curled leaf lifted from the mouth of the side channel. It was a complete record of a very modest walk. Tessa ran the side of her glove lightly over the page, though the pencil needed no drying. Then she closed the notebook and returned it to her coat pocket. She picked up the thermos and remained beside the stone for another moment. The mill was close now. Through the trees, she could make out the dark line of the wheelhouse roof and a pale section of wall above it. The yard beyond would still hold a little open light. The kitchen garden lay on the other side, receiving the water that had turned away upstream. The path between the first stone and the wheelhouse had needed almost no clearing on her way out. Tessa walked it slowly all the same. A pair of leaves had lodged against a tuft at the very edge. Water passed well beyond them, and their stems were already caught in the grass rather than the race. She left them. A short twig lay lengthwise in the shallow margin. It was loose, so she lifted it and placed it on the bank. The channel did not change its sound. Near the wheelhouse, the stone lining became more regular. The water drew itself into the secured channel and passed beneath the lower part of the mill. Its surface darkened under the building, while the sound became enclosed and full. Tessa stepped off the narrow path and into the yard. Evening had settled there during her walk. The gravel no longer held the day's warmth so clearly, and the main windows reflected the gray-blue sky. Beyond the kitchen garden, the bakehouse roof was a quiet shape. The orchard stood behind it, row after row of still branches. She turned to look upstream once more. The race disappeared around the first bend. Beyond that were the first stone, the garden division, the second and third stones, and the sluice meadow. She had seen each part in order, and then seen it again on the return. No work remained outside. Tessa removed her gloves and placed them across the top of the canvas bag. The damp fingertips cooled in the air. She shifted the thermos into her free hand and crossed the yard toward the mill door. The next part of the evening would take place inside. She would set the 3 levels properly into the mill record, put away the notebook and cups, and go down once more to the wheelroom. There the secured wheel would remain still, the channel would remain unloaded, and the water she had followed from the meadow would pass beneath the resting mechanism. Behind her, the garden side channel continued toward the beds. Beside her, the Millrace entered the wheelhouse with a steady, darkening hush. Tessa reached the door, rested her hand on the latch, and listened until the 2 sounds settled easily into their separate courses. Tessa lifted the latch and opened the mill door. The main floor received her with its familiar cooler air. Evening light still reached through the windows, though it had narrowed since she left. It lay in long gray bands across the boards, showing the grain of the wood and the faint flour dust gathered in its shallow seams. She stepped inside with the thermos in one hand and the canvas bag over her shoulder. Behind her, the Millrace continued into the wheelhouse. Its sound followed her through the doorway, then softened when she drew the door nearly closed. She left it open by the width of her hand. That was enough to admit a little air from the yard and a quiet thread of running water. The wider sound of Alder Brook remained farther off. The narrower race stayed close to the building, smooth and continuous. Tessa set the thermos on the table. The canvas bag came next. She placed it beside the thermos, took out the folded cloth, and laid the 2 cups upon it. One had held her mint drink in the meadow. The other had been used by the neighbor walking home. Both were empty and already wiped, but a little dampness remained inside them. She stood them upright where the air could reach them. Her gloves were damp only at the fingertips. Tessa spread them beside the cups with their palms facing upward. Small, dark patches showed where she had lifted twigs and wet leaves from the maintained water path. Nothing clung to the fabric. The gloves simply needed time to dry. All of this took less than a minute. It was the kind of gentle work that ended an evening outdoors. Setting down what had been carried, opening what needed air, and returning each small object to a quiet state before putting it away. Tessa took the notebook from her coat pocket. The cover felt cool from the path. She placed it near the middle of the table, found the pencil in the same pocket, and sat on the wooden chair. For a few moments she listened. Water passed below the resting mill. A board in the main floor settled with one low creak. Outside, a light movement of air touched the open door and brought in the scent of damp grass from beside the race. Nothing interrupted anything else. Tessa opened the notebook to the page she had used along the path. The pencil marks were plain in the fading light. She read them from the beginning, not because she had forgotten the walk, but because reading them in order was part of transferring them properly into the mill record. The first stone stood a little below its pale line. The second touched the seam. The third rested within the darker band. The garden side channel was open and drawing its usual share toward the beds. Leaves had been light. Small twigs had been removed. The sluice setting had remained unchanged. One curled leaf had been lifted from the mouth of the garden channel, where its stem had tapped against a shallow stone without affecting the flow. At dusk, the first stone had been unchanged. The short notes held the whole walk. There was no gap between them and nothing left to explain. Tessa turned toward the shelf behind the table. A broad ledger rested there between two empty wooden trays. She reached for it, brought it down with both hands, and laid it beside the notebook. The cover made a soft sound against the table. When she opened the ledger, the pages released a dry smell of paper, flour, and old wood. Earlier records filled the first part in neat lines. Some entries were brief, others longer, depending on what the mill had required. Tonight required only a few clear sentences. Tessa found the next open space. She wrote the date first. Beneath it, she recorded the 3 familiar stones in downstream order, beginning with the third near the sluice, and ending with the first below the garden turn. In the notebook, she had written the marks as she encountered them. In the ledger, she set them down according to the direction of the water. Third stone, level within the usual dark band. Second stone, level at the lower edge of the seam. Garden side channel, open, clear, and drawing normally. First stone. Level slightly below the pale line unchanged at dusk. She paused and listened to the pencil moving over the paper. Its small, rough sound sat lightly above the water below. On the next line, she added that scattered leaves and small twigs had been lifted by hand from the maintained path. The sluice had not been adjusted. No cutting, digging, or repair had been needed. Then she recorded the explanation for the quieter flow at the wheelhouse. The garden channel was taking its ordinary share. That sentence was enough. It named the cause without making it larger than it was. Tessa read the completed entry once. The levels agreed with what she had seen. The order was clear. The work was finished. She closed the notebook and slid the pencil beneath its cover. The notebook returned to the canvas bag, ready for another evening. The ledger remained open for a little longer, while the fresh pencil marks settled into the page. Outside the window, the last pale color was leaving the yard. The bakehouse roof had become a dark, simple shape beyond the kitchen garden. Behind it, the orchard branches blended softly together. None of those places required her attention tonight. The bakehouse would have its own work later in the week, so would the orchard. The grain loft waited above with its folded sacks and empty bins. This evening still belonged to the water, but only to its ending now. Tessa took the cloth and dried the inside of each cup. She turned the cloth around one finger and followed the curved base, then wiped the rims once more. The thermos cup fitted back over the top with a short, smooth turn. The spare cup went into the canvas bag. She folded the cloth with the damp side inward and placed it beside the gloves rather than packing it away. It could dry there overnight. The gloves would also remain on the table. By morning, the dark patches at the fingertips would be gone. Tessa closed the ledger. She returned it to the shelf, setting it squarely between the wooden trays. There it held the evening in a form that needed no further thought. 3 levels, 1 ordinary division of water, a few leaves and several small twigs. She stood beside the table and looked once around the main floor. The empty bins along the wall were closed. The folded canvas sacks remained in place. The loft stairs rose into shadow. Window latches sat properly, and the boards beneath her boots were dry. She moved to the door and looked into the yard. The remaining light was enough to show the gravel and the beginning of the Millrace path. The path itself disappeared after the first bend, but Tessa no longer needed to see its full length. She had followed it upstream and back. The meadow was settled. The sluice was secured. The 3 stones stood in moving water at their familiar marks. Nearer at hand, the garden side channel continued beyond the yard. Its sound was finer than the race, almost hidden beneath the rustle of the beds. The water going that way had not gone missing. It was passing through the low channel exactly where it belonged. Tessa drew the door closed. The latch settled into place, and the outside sounds became quieter. They did not vanish. The mill was too close to water for silence of that kind. The brook remained beyond the wall, and the race moved beneath the lower room. She crossed the main floor toward the inner door. At the top of the wheelroom stairs, she paused to let her eyes adjust. The lower room was dimmer now. A small lamp waited on the wall beside the doorway. Tessa lit it and turned the flame low. Warm light spread over the nearest stair treads and reached the heavy wooden supports below. The rest of the room stayed in soft shadow. She descended carefully. With each step, the water grew fuller. Its enclosed murmur rose around the stonework and resting mechanism, until it became the main sound in the room. The wheel remained secured and unloaded, exactly as she had left it before walking upstream. Tessa reached the bottom and stood beside the dry wooden support she had touched earlier. The wood had lost the trace of daytime warmth. It felt cool beneath her palm now, though not damp. The secured parts held still above the channel. No belt moved, no shaft turned. Nothing carried grain, and nothing asked the water to do more than pass through. She removed her hand and watched the channel. The water entered the darker space beneath the wheel, moved around stone and timber, and continued beyond the room. Lamplight touched the nearer surface in a narrow amber reflection. The reflection lengthened, broke around a ripple, and gathered again. Earlier, the channel had sounded a little quieter than Tessa remembered. Now she knew why. Upstream, the full race entered from the sluice meadow. Near the garden, a modest share turned away between the low, firm banks. What remained continued past the first stone and entered the wheelhouse. The flow below her was not weak or uncertain. It was simply the portion belonging to this channel after the garden had received its share. Tessa listened without trying to measure the sound again. There was no need to compare it with another evening, or imagine what might be happening beyond the wall. She had seen the whole maintained course in the open air. She had watched the water at all 3 stones. She had stood beside the division. She had recorded the levels. The sound could now be only itself. Water entered. Water passed beneath the secured wheel. Water continued toward Alder Brook. The sequence repeated without effort. Tessa moved a little closer to the channel, remaining on the dry floor. Near the entrance, the water made a close, fine murmur. Under the resting structure, the sound deepened. At the far opening, it became lighter again. Those changes belonged to the shape of the room. The pace beneath them remained even. She drew a slow breath. The air smelled of wet stone, dark timber, and the faint flower sawdust that found its way even to the lower parts of the mill. The lamp added a slight warm scent of its own. Above, the main floor gave a quiet settling sound. Tessa could picture the table with the gloves spread open and the folded cloth beside them. The thermos stood closed. The spare cup rested in the canvas bag. The notebook held its pathside marks, and the ledger held the clean account. Everything carried in had found a place. Everything noticed had been understood. Everything moved had been small enough to lift with one gloved hand. She stayed beside the channel for a while. There was no further check hidden inside the listening. She did not need to inspect the sluice again, or return to the stones, or follow the garden channel to the beds. Each part had already answered the simple question asked of it. The garden received water. The Millrace remained clear. The wheel stayed secured. The unloaded channel passed its evening flow. Tessa lowered the lamp flame a little more. The amber reflection on the water narrowed. It appeared, disappeared beneath the wheel, and showed again near the far opening. The room seemed to breathe around that repeating movement, though nothing in it moved except the water and the small flame. After a time, Tessa turned toward the stairs. She climbed slowly, carrying the steady sound with her from one step to the next. At the top, she looked back once. The wheel remained a dark, resting shape above the channel. The lamp gave enough light for the room and no more. She left it low and closed the inner door until only a narrow opening remained. The water could still be heard from the main floor, softened now by wood and distance. Tessa sat in the chair beside the table. She did not reopen the notebook or ledger. The levels were recorded, and the record was complete. Instead, she rested her hands on her knees and listened as the mill settled around the finished work. Below, water moved through the secured channel. Outside, another part moved quietly toward the kitchen garden. Farther off, Alder Brook carried both courses onward in its broader sound. The three movements did not need to be separated anymore. They belonged to the same familiar place, each following its ordinary route through the dusk. The grain loft waited above for a later evening, when Tessa would climb the stairs and begin its simple work among canvas sacks, empty bins, warm boards, and flour dust. For now, she remained on the main floor with the path behind her. The water levels entered, and the gentle work of the Millrace fully done. Tessa remained beside the table until the mill had grown fully accustomed to the dusk. The last light at the windows was no longer strong enough to make clear bands across the floor. It rested instead as a soft gray brightness on the glass and along the edges of the empty bins. The beams overhead had disappeared into shadow. The loft stairs were still visible, though only as a plain rising shape against the wall. Below, water continued through the secured channel. Its sound reached the main floor through the narrow opening of the inner door. It was quieter here than in the wheel room, with the deeper notes softened by timber and distance. The rhythm remained easy to follow. Water entered beneath the resting structure, passed through the lower room, and continued toward Alder Brook. Tessa drew one slow breath and stood. The chair moved lightly against the boards. She lifted it by the back, set it squarely beneath the table, and looked over the few things she had left to dry. The gloves lay open with their palms upward. Their fingertips were still darker than the rest, but no water remained on the table beneath them. The folded cloth held a little dampness inside its layers. Tessa unfolded it once and spread it flat beside the gloves. It could remain there until morning. The thermos was closed. The spare cup had been returned to the canvas bag. The notebook rested inside with the pencil tucked beneath its cover. On the shelf, the ledger sat between the two empty wooden trays, holding the 3 water levels and the short account of the evening's work. Nothing needed to be carried back outside except the thermos and the canvas bag. Tessa slipped the bag over her shoulder, then left it there while she crossed to the inner door. The lamp below still gave a low, amber light through the narrow opening. She went down the stairs once more. This was not another inspection. The stones had been checked, the side channel understood, and the sluice left secured in its familiar setting. Tessa was only returning for the lamp, and for one final passage through the lower room before closing the mill for the evening. The air cooled around her as she descended. Wet stone and dark timber gave the wheel room its steady scent. Near the bottom step, the channel's murmur widened until it seemed to fill the space beneath the main floor. The wheel remained still. Tessa crossed the dry boards to the lamp. Its small flame leaned slightly when she moved past, then stood upright again. The amber reflection trembled on the nearest water and broke into several narrow lines. She paused with one hand near the lamp. Without the brighter evening light from outside, the far end of the channel had become a deep gray opening. Water passed through it without hesitation. The surface could be seen only where it caught the flame, yet its movement was plain in the changing reflection and in the continuous sound around the stonework. Earlier, the quieter run had invited a walk upstream. That walk had led past the first familiar stone, a little below its pale line, and onward to the garden division. It had continued to the second stone at its seam, and the third within its darker band. It had taken Tessa to the sluice meadow, where the full maintained flow entered the race, before giving a modest share to the garden. Now the same water completed its return beneath the mill. There was nothing uneven in it that required an answer. The quicker lines and smoother margins belonged to the shape of the channel. The softer sound belonged to the ordinary division upstream. The light ticking at the garden turn had belonged to one curled leaf touching a shallow stone, and the leaf now rested on the grass above the bank. Each small question had ended where it was found. Tessa turned the lamp lower. The flame shortened. Its reflection drew close to the wall, leaving the farther surface dark. She waited until the flame was steady, then put it out. For a moment, the room seemed quieter, though the water had not changed. Her eyes adjusted to the remaining dusk admitted through the channel openings. The wheel and its supports became broad shapes. The stairs showed as a pale angle leading upward. Tessa rested her palm against the dry wooden support one last time. "Good night," she said. The words settled beneath the sound of the water. She crossed to the stairs and climbed. At the top, she drew the inner door closed. The latch met its place, with a small wooden click. The channel could still be heard through the floor. On the main level, Tessa picked up the thermos and gave the room a final, unhurried look. The window latches were set. The bins were closed. The canvas sacks remained folded along the wall. The loft stairs led upward to work that belonged to another evening, not this one. The gloves and cloth had been left where air could reach them. The ledger had been returned to its shelf. She did not climb to the grain loft. She did not open the bins or move the sacks. It was enough to know they were resting above the main floor in the dry air of the mill. Tessa went to the outer door and lifted the latch. Cool evening air entered around her. It carried dampness from the Millrace and the greener scent of the kitchen garden. She stepped into the yard and pulled the door closed behind her. The key turned easily in the lock. She tested the latch once, returned the key to her pocket, and stood on the gravel with the canvas bag against her side and the thermos in her hand. The yard had settled into dusk. The wheelhouse made a dark line beside the water. Above it, the main floor windows held a faint reflection of the remaining sky. The grain loft rose quietly over them. Beyond the garden, the bakehouse roof was almost the same color as the orchard behind it. Nothing moved there except a few leaves at the ends of the branches. Tessa listened to the two nearby courses of water. The Millrace entered the wheelhouse with its smooth, enclosed hush. The garden side channel moved more lightly beyond the yard, passing between its low banks toward the beds. Farther away, Alder Brook carried a broader sound beneath both. She could now place each sound without needing to see its whole course. The full race came from the sluice meadow. A smaller share turned toward the garden. The rest passed the first stone and entered the secured unloaded channel beneath the mill. Beyond the building, it returned to the brook. The arrangement was ordinary and complete. Tessa crossed the yard slowly. Gravel shifted beneath her boots in short, dry movements. Near the corner of the wheelhouse, she stopped at the beginning of the Millrace path. The first stretch was still visible. It followed the bank toward the bend, narrowing beneath the branches. Beyond that bend stood the first stone. Farther upstream, hidden by the evening and the shape of the ground, were the garden turn, the second and third stones, and the meadow sluice. She had walked the path in both directions. There was no need to follow it again. Even so, she remained for a little while at its lower end. The race entered from the dimness with a surface that appeared almost black beneath the branches. Now and then, a small patch of sky showed on it and traveled toward the wheelhouse. A leaf floated through one such patch, turned gently, and continued downstream. It did not catch. The light debris Tessa had lifted rested on the higher banks along the path. The small twigs would dry among the grass and hedge. The rooted water plant remained where it belonged, bending with the current over the shallow grit. The maintained water path was clear without having been stripped bare. Tessa adjusted the strap of the canvas bag. The thermos had cooled in her hand. Its contents were nearly finished, but the small remaining warmth could still be felt through the metal when she curled her fingers around it. She left the beginning of the race and walked toward the kitchen garden. The garden beds were quiet in the dusk. Their edges showed as low, orderly lines in the earth. Tessa did not enter between them. She stopped where the side channel passed near the yard and listened. The water here was shallower and finer than the race. It moved with a small brushing sound over soil and stones, carrying its ordinary share through the maintained course. Nothing in the beds was flooded. Nothing at the channel edge had fallen inward. The evening watering was simply continuing. That was the end of the quieter sound she had noticed from the wheel room. Part of the water had come here. It had not vanished. It had not been held back. It had taken the familiar turn and reached the garden. Tessa stood long enough to hear the channel repeat its soft pattern several times. Water touched a stone, spread over a shallow place, and gathered again. Then it continued beyond the nearest beds. She did not take out the notebook. The garden turn had already been entered in the ledger, and this quiet view from the yard added no new fact. It only joined the sound beside the mill to the visible water in front of her. Tessa turned away from the beds. Beyond them, the bakehouse and orchard remained dark, resting shapes. Their work would come on later evenings. The bakehouse would be opened and warmed when it was time to prepare it. The orchard path would be tended when that task arrived. Tonight, neither required even a closer look. The return path now led across the yard toward the footbridge. Tessa followed it at an even pace. As she moved away from the mill, the separate sounds began to settle together. The narrow side channel became difficult to hear first. The Millrace remained close for a few more steps, then softened behind the wheelhouse. Alder Brook grew broader as she approached the bridge. At the edge of the yard, she looked back. The mill stood beside the water with all its doors secured. The gloves and cloth were drying on the table inside. The ledger rested on its shelf. Beneath the main floor, the unloaded wheel remained still while water passed through the channel. There was no unfinished outdoor work waiting in the dusk. Tessa continued to the footbridge. The wooden rail felt cool when she placed one hand upon it. She stepped onto the boards, and her boots gave the same muted knocks she had heard on her arrival. Below, Alder Brook moved between its banks, carrying broken reflections of the dim sky. Near the middle of the bridge, she stopped. Upstream, the brook and Millrace lay close enough that their sounds touched. The maintained race drew its share toward the mill, while the wider brook continued beside it. Downstream, the returned water joined the broader course again beyond the wheelhouse. The water had a way into the mill and a way out. The garden channel had its smaller way through the beds. All three courses remained connected to the same familiar brook. Tessa rested both forearms lightly on the rail. The canvas bag settled against her coat. She placed the thermos beside one hand, loosened its cup, and poured the last of the mint drink. Only a little steam appeared now. She drank slowly while watching the surface beneath the bridge. A pale piece of reflected sky stretched between two darker movements, narrowed and opened again. The brook did not hold one shape for long, but its direction remained steady. The cup warmed her fingers. Behind her the mill yard was still. Ahead the lane rested between the hedges, its packed earth faintly visible in the dusk. The return along it required no decision. It was the same ordinary route by which she had arrived. Tessa finished the drink and closed the thermos. She listened once more to Alder Brook, not to judge its depth or pace, but because the sound was broad enough to contain the smaller sounds she had followed all evening. The smooth race beneath the branches, the lighter garden channel over shallow stones, the enclosed murmur beneath the secured wheel. Here at the bridge, they belonged together again. Tessa lifted the thermos and continued across. At the far end, she left the wooden boards for the firm earth of the lane. The air beneath the hedges was cool, and the day's stored warmth had nearly gone from the ground. Her steps found an easy pace without effort. She did not look back immediately. The mill remained where it had always stood, beside the brook, with the wheel room below, the main floor above it, and the grain loft resting over both. The bakehouse and orchard waited beyond the kitchen garden. The path beside the millrace continued upstream toward the sluice meadow, clear enough for water and ready for another quiet evening. After several steps, Tessa turned her head. Through the opening beyond the bridge, she could still see the upper part of the mill. Its windows held the last faint gray of the sky. No lamp shone within. None was needed. The building was secured. The channel was unloaded. The levels were recorded. The garden was receiving its share. Tessa faced the lane again. Alder Brook remained audible behind her, steady beneath the softer sound of her boots. She carried no unanswered question away from the mill. The canvas bag held the notebook and cup. The thermos was empty. The evening's work rested in the ledger, and the water continued by its known paths through the deepening dusk. She walked on at the same unhurried pace, leaving the mill settled behind her, and the next quiet part of the evening open ahead. Night settled by degrees along the lane. Tessa walked beneath the hedges with the empty thermos in one hand and the canvas bag resting against her side. The packed earth was firm beneath her boots. It had given up most of the warmth stored during the day, though now and then she crossed a dry patch that still held a little of it. Behind her, Alder Brook continued beside the mill. The sound reached along the lane more easily than the remaining light. It came broad and steady through the leaves, carrying within it the smaller movements she had listened to all evening. The millrace drew water toward the secured channel. The side course carried its modest share through the kitchen garden. Beyond the wheelhouse, the passing water returned to the brook. From the lane, those separate sounds had become one again. Tessa did not need to turn back to place them. She had walked their course while there was light enough to see the pale grit beneath the race and the old marks on the three familiar stones. She had watched the water divide at the garden turn. She had followed the maintained path to the sluice meadow and returned beside the same steady flow. Now the path beside the water was behind her. Her steps continued at an even pace. The hedges rose darkly on either side, but the lane itself remained visible as a soft gray strip. Above it, the sky showed between branches. The last evening color had faded, leaving no sharp edge between the fields and the air. Tessa listened to the small sounds close at hand. One boot met the earth, then the other. The canvas bag brushed lightly against her coat. The thermos shifted in her fingers. Beneath all of them, the brook continued. Nothing required an answer. At the mill, the outer door was locked. The window latches were set. The bins on the main floor were closed, and the folded canvas sacks remained along the wall. Her gloves lay open on the table with their damp fingertips turned toward the air. The cloth had been unfolded beside them. By morning, both would be dry. The notebook rested inside the canvas bag she carried. Its short pathside entries had already been transferred to the broader ledger on the shelf. Third stone within its usual dark band. Second stone touching the lower edge of the seam. Garden channel open and drawing normally. First stone a little below its pale line, unchanged at dusk. Light leaves and small twigs removed by hand. Sluice setting unchanged. The record was complete. The notebook did not need to be opened again tonight. Tessa walked a little farther. As the lane curved, the mill disappeared fully behind the hedges. Its upper windows no longer showed through the opening near the bridge. The building had gone from sight without feeling distant. Its arrangement remained clear in her mind. The wheel room below, the main floor above, and the grain loft resting over both. Beyond the kitchen garden stood the bakehouse and orchard. Upstream lay the sluice meadow. Each place remained where it belonged, resting in the same night. Tessa changed the thermos from one hand to the other. The metal was cool now. Earlier in the meadow, the cup had warmed her gloves, while a little steam rose from the mint drink. The neighbor had stopped on the ordinary way home, accepted the spare cup, and sat beside the race for a few quiet minutes. The words they had exchanged were finished too. The water looked clear. The garden beds would be glad of their share. Then the empty cup had been wiped and put away, and the footsteps had continued downstream. There was nothing unfinished in the meeting, and nothing to be carried forward from it. It belonged to the simple middle of the walk, as ordinary as the meadow grass brushing together, or the pale seed husk moving steadily around the bend. Tessa's pace softened as the lane leveled. She was no longer walking to inspect anything. She did not look along the hedge for fallen branches or study the ground for signs of water. The work had ended at the mill. This part of the evening was only the quiet distance after it. The brook became fainter around the curve. For several steps, Tessa heard it clearly. Then the leaves softened it. Then the lane rose slightly, and the sound lowered further. It never vanished altogether. A broad hush remained behind the hedges, steady enough to follow without effort. Tessa let her breathing settle beside it. In the wheel room, water would still be entering beneath the resting structure. It would pass through the darker space, where the low lamp had made an amber line. The lamp was out now, but the water did not require light. It continued around the stonework and beneath the dry wooden supports, making the same close murmur near the entrance and the same deeper sound under the wheel. The wheel itself remained secured and unloaded. No belt moved, no shaft turned, no grain passed through the millstones. The mechanism held its weight quietly while the channel carried only water. Tessa had listened until the sound needed no more measuring. She could hear that settled passage now without being in the room. Not every ripple, and not every small change around timber and stone, but the simple order of it. Water entered. Water passed beneath the still wheel. Water returned to Alder Brook. The order continued after the lamp went out and after the door was locked. Along the garden side channel, another smaller order continued. Water left the main race at the maintained turn. It moved over shallow soil and brown stones. It reached the beds without flooding their edges. Then it went onward by its familiar course. The curled leaf that had made the faint ticking sound no longer touched the stone at the channel mouth. Tessa had lifted it by hand and set it several widths from the bank. There it could lie through the night, its yellow edge drying against the grass. The leaf had made a sound, not a blockage. That small discovery had been complete the moment she saw it rise and settle with the current. Once removed, it required no further thought. Farther up the race, the other leaves she had gathered rested on the meadow bank. The few slender twigs lay beyond the water's reach. The rooted plants still streamed over the shallow grit because it belonged there and had never needed moving. The maintained path was clear. It had not been emptied of every leaf, stone, or living strand. It did not need to be. Water found its way between them, quicker in the center and slower along the margins. A loose leaf could travel. A flat leaf could remain against the bank. A small twig could be lifted from a catch. A rooted plant could bend with the current. The distinctions had been quiet and easy to make. Tessa passed beneath a place where branches met over the lane. The air felt cooler there. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder and continued without changing pace. Her eyes had grown used to the night. The ground ahead showed enough variation to guide her steps. Pale dust lay in the shallow hollows of the lane. Darker earth marked the edges where grass began. The hedges held no detail now, except the occasional leaf that caught a little sky. She did not hurry toward the end of the walk. The evening had been made of unhurried passages. Through the main floor, down the wheelroom stairs, along the bank, across the sluice meadow, and back beside the garden turn. Each passage had led naturally into the next. The lane could do the same. One step followed another. One breath followed another. Behind her, one length of water followed the next. At the upper sluice, the secured setting remained square. Water entered beneath it at its ordinary mild weather level. It moved past the third stone, touching the darker band along the stone's side. Farther down, it met the seam on the second stone. After the garden received its share, the remaining race passed the first stone, a little below the old pale line. The marks did not need to match one another. Each stone sat in a different part of the channel. Together they gave one calm account. Tessa had entered that account in downstream order, following the direction of the water. The ledger now held it between earlier records and the clean space for evenings still to come. The book was closed. Its dry pages rested on the shelf between the wooden trays. Nothing in the record suggested repair. Nothing asked for a changed sluice setting. Nothing called her back to the meadow. The water path had needed only the light attention she had given it. Night gathered more fully around the lane. A mild breeze moved along the hedge tops. It did not reach the ground with much force. Tessa felt it only as a cooler touch near her face and heard it as a brief stirring overhead. When it passed, the lane became still again. She shifted the empty thermos beneath her arm. The cup was screwed firmly over its top. Inside the canvas bag, the spare cup sat beside the notebook, clean and dry enough to carry. The pencil remained tucked beneath the notebook cover. Each object had completed its use for the evening. The thermos had carried warmth to the meadow and to the bridge. The cups had been shared, wiped, and packed. The notebook had carried the levels indoors. The gloves had lifted wet leaves and twigs, then been spread to dry. The cloth had dried the cups and now lay open on the table. The ledger held the finished account. There was comfort in the plainness of those uses. Nothing had been asked to do more than it was made for. The same was true of the Millrace. It carried water from the sluice meadow toward the mill. The side channel watered the kitchen garden. The secured channel allowed the remaining flow to pass beneath the unloaded wheel. Alder Brook received it again. The course was neither hurried nor uncertain. It simply continued through the land in shapes made familiar by long use. Tessa slowed near another gentle bend. The brook could barely be heard here. Its broad sound had become a low presence beneath the quiet of the lane. She stopped for a moment, not because anything had changed, but because standing still allowed the evening to settle around her without the rhythm of her boots. The thermos rested against her palm. The bag strap lay across her shoulder. Cool air touched her coat sleeves. The hedges held the lane between them. Somewhere beyond the bend behind her, the footbridge crossed Alder Brook. Beyond the bridge stood the mill yard. The mill itself was closed and dark, its old timber releasing the last stored warmth of the day. A board might settle on the main floor. Another might answer from the loft. Below them, water would continue without pause. Those were resting sounds. Tessa had heard them often enough to know their size. A creak began and ended. A small movement in the wood found its place. The steady channel remained beneath it. She resumed walking. Her boots returned quietly to the earth. The working part of the evening receded without disappearing. It had become something finished, held in the mill rather than carried as a list in her thoughts. She did not need to repeat the readings to remember them. She did not need to picture every bend in order. She could let the stones stand beneath the water without watching. She could let the garden channel move beyond the beds without following. She could let the secured wheel remain still in the dark. The mill had been left in a stable state, and stability did not require attention every moment. It was enough that each part had been checked, understood, and returned to rest. Tessa's shoulders loosened beneath her coat. The canvas bag seemed lighter, though it held the same notebook and cup. The empty thermos carried almost no weight. Her hands were no longer chilled from the race. The warmth made by walking had spread evenly through her fingers. She breathed in the mild night air. It smelled of leaves, dry earth, and the faint dampness that followed the brook along the lane. The sharper scent of wet stone belonged farther back, close to the Millrace. The flower dust and canvas belonged inside the mill. The greener scent of watered soil belonged to the garden beds. Each remained in its own place, joined by the evening but not confused with the others. Ahead, the lane continued as a pale level course beneath the sky. It held no turn that needed considering. Tessa knew the way, and the way required only walking. She let her attention rest on the repetition of it, the soft press of one boot, the brief lift between steps, the soft press of the other, the small movement of cloth, the quiet breath, again and again. The sound of Alder Brook faded a little more, but the rhythm it had given the evening stayed with her. The lane seemed to keep that rhythm in a drier, gentler form. At the mill, water passed over stone. Here, boots passed over earth. At the mill, the channel narrowed and opened. Here, the lane curved and straightened. Neither movement needed to be forced. Tessa walked until the footbridge, yard, and meadow belonged fully to the night behind her. She thought once of the grain loft, not as a task waiting to interrupt this evening, and not as work that needed planning now. It was simply the next part of the mill's ordinary rhythm. Above the main floor, the loft remained dry. Canvas sacks waited folded in their place. The empty bins were closed. Warm boards held the faint, settled scent of flower dust. On another evening, Tessa would climb the stairs. She would open the loft to lamplight, clean what needed cleaning, and take the simple inventory in its proper order. She would learn again the quiet storage rhythm of sacks, bins, labels, and space. That evening had not begun yet. Tonight belonged to the Millrace all the way to its end. Tessa left the thought of the loft where it was, resting above the mill. The lane carried her onward. Behind her, the three familiar stones remained in their familiar water. The side channel continued through the garden. The wheel stayed secured. The ledger stayed closed. The gloves and cloth dried slowly on the table. Nothing had been left unresolved. Nothing needed watching through the night. The old mill could hold its own quiet now. Tessa continued beneath the hedges until even the brook's broad hush had softened into the distance. She did not strain to keep hearing it. The sound had accompanied her far enough. The night around her was calm and mild. Her hands were empty of work. Her pace remained slow. And beside the darkened mill, water followed every known course, steadily and without help, while the rooms above it settled toward morning,